but you'll notice there's a couple of things we need to do before we execute that. So let's have a look at that. So let's click next. And before we go and name anything, let's look at the things that we need to provide to it. So the very first thing here is this the name of this role. I think I'm going to actually remove this from the stack, so we're going to go ahead and ignore that. This next thing is the availability zones. So when an auto-scaling group is launching an instance, it'll choose an availability zone that hasn't been used before. And an availability zone is basically a distinct data center that AWS controls in a particular region. And you'll see that for this particular region, there are 4 distinct availability zones, so 4 data centers. And a particular type of EC2 instance is not necessarily supported in every availability zone. So be sure to do a little bit of research. And as you'll see, we're using a T2 micro here. Try to understand the region that you're launching this in and understand what availability zones might be available for that particular EC2 instance type. Now, if you don't know, you can just select everything. And these availability zones need to be tied to where a public subnet is running in. And if you don't know what a public subnet is, I would encourage you to maybe Google around a little bit and learn a little bit about AWS VPCs and subnets. That's going to be very key to being successful in AWS. So learn about that. So for me, I'm just going to select everything. I know that the T2 micro instance is not available in every one of these regions. But what's going to happen is the launch configuration is going to try to launch my instance in a particular availability zone. It'll fail, and then it's going to choose another one and launch it in that. So I'm not necessarily too worried about that. Now, like this suggests, this is at an additional cost. What this means is, by default, these instances are going to launch with 8 gigs on their volume size. If you want to attach another volume to it, so yes, I want to attach another volume, how big do you want that volume to be in gigabytes? And all this is going to do is it's going to make this mountable on our EC2 instance. So it will attach the volume, but then you have to SSH into your instance and you have to physically run the mount command. And then you'll probably want to move your server code into that directory. So this is going to require a little bit more of an advanced setup, but like I say here, this does come at an additional cost. So this is the CIDR IP that you want to allow to SSH into your instance on port 22. So for me, I would go to something like my IP, click enter, copy that IP in here. So let's say my IP was 34.23.45.6. If that was my IP, I would need to say /32 because it's a CIDR range. And /32 just means one IP, this IP. So now that we have that in there, now the very first thing here is when we are launching this template for the very first time, I actually want to set my desired capacity to 0, and I want to come down here and set my minimum capacity to 0. So what this means is the number of EC2 instances I want to immediately launch when I am launching this CloudFormation template. And that needs to, it can't be any lower than your minimum capacity. And then the minimum capacity is the least number of instances I want to have running at any given time. And then the maximum capacity is the maximum number of EC2 instances I want to be running at any given time. And then the T2 micro, so we can go up here and say EC2 instance types. And then click on this. And we can see all of our instance types. So here's T2. And then we could see all the T2 types. It'll tell us, you know, how many virtual CPUs, the memory that's going to be available, and then kind of the network performance that we can expect from that instance. So be sure to choose the one that's right for you. For me, in this testing scenario, a testing instance of T2 is going to be perfect. And then also note that T2 is free. So I've set this up in the free tier. Be sure to read those free tier permissions. And in fact, let me show you what that is. So if I come over here to EC2, I can click Launch Instances. And we are actually launching an Amazon Linux 2 as part of this stack. So I'm going to click Select here. And you'll see that the T2 Micro is free tier eligible. And you'll see that micro instances are eligible for free tier for the first 12 months, and you get up to 750 hours each month. But then after that year, you have to pay for it. And you can look up the costs again. So we can go like T2 Micro costs. Here we go. This is what I was looking for. So here we go. So the T2 Micro, after a year, we can say on demand, it'll cost that much, or we could pay for it for a year, or we can pay for it for 3 years in advance. And that's how much it would be hourly. So if I did a little bit of calculation here, so if I paid for it on demand, and I would run it for 24 hours a day, for 7 days a week, and for roughly 4 weeks in a month, and 12 months in a year. So it costs you about $93 a year to run a T2 Micro 24/7. And obviously that can get less if you pay for it in advance. So if we were 12, you'll see we get about a $50 savings, and that's going to get even more. And that's if you pay it for, I'm going to run this for 3 years. So you see you can get costs there. So be sure to do a little bit of research on costs and the instant type that you're going to be using. I would suggest probably using on-demand pricing until you figure out what instance is going to be best for your particular scenario. Okay, so, and then these are just names that you can apply. So it's going to generate these things and give it these names. So if you want to give it custom names, go ahead and do that. And then this, you can click the drop down, and depending on what subnet you want to launch it in, and again, this is a drop down that will list all the available VPCs. Be sure to select subnets that are public, because you want to have this instance be publicly accessible. And the only reason you wouldn't be doing that is if you're in the more an advanced scenario, and you probably won't be using this CloudFormation template if you are, but you would be putting it behind like a network load balancer, and then having that network load balancer be public, but your EC2 instance be private. So that's one way that you can do that. But in this particular case, select all the subnets that are going to correspond to all the availability zones that you want to launch it in. And then the Route 53 hosted zone to update. Now, again, this is optional, but I've added this in here. So as soon as you launch an EC2 server, it's going to automatically have a DNS name to update. So if you don't have a DNS record imported into AWS, you can import it from other sources like GoDaddy, Namecheap. There's tons of places where you can buy a DNS name. Essentially, you're gonna put that in here into AWS, and it's gonna be named a hosted zone. You can also buy hosted zones straight from AWS. That's fine. And then you're gonna have to put a record in here. So for me, I have CyberBulletGames, so I'm gonna select that. So now that I've selected CyberBulletGames, I'm gonna say I have a record called unityserver.cyberbulletgames.com, and then let's make sure that that record exists. So let's go to Route 53. And when I search for this, I don't have any record here for Unity server. So I'm gonna create a record. I'm gonna call it Unity server. and it's going to be an A record because we're going to be putting an IP address in here. And for my TTL, I want it to be low, so say 30 seconds. So this one, I'm going to put something in here that doesn't really go to anything because it's going to automatically update anyway. So now that we have our record here that we just placed with some rando IP, it doesn't matter, it's not going anywhere. So now that we have that in there, we can come back in here and we can put that in there now. The other thing that you're going to be missing here is your SSH key name. So we need to create an SSH key that we can use to SSH into our EC2 instance. So we're going to go to the EC2 instance console, and we're going to scroll down here under network and security, and we're going to call it key pairs. We're going to create a key pair, and I'm going to just call it Unity server, make it RSA, and while I am going to use this with PuTTY, I'll show you how I can convert it to PuTTY format, but I'm going to select PEM. You're going to want to select PEM if you're using Linux or Mac for sure. You can also select PEM if you're using Windows, and I'll show you how to convert it to a PPK here shortly. But I'm going to select PEM. I'm going to create the key pair, and I'm going to save that to my desktop. Okay. And if you forget to save it during this window, there's no way you can do this again. You need to come up here and you need to delete your key and recreate it because there's no way to get it. That's the only time you can ever download that PEM. But basically, I can come in here, select my key value, and that's the key that is going to get applied to my EC2 instance. Now, this Unity server port is very important because what you need to do here is you need to set this port according to whatever you've built your server with. Now, like I said, by default, I have it on 7777, but on your transport layer inside of Unity, when you're selecting the transport you want to use, there's always a port configuration. Be sure that that port makes sense here and they match, and then be sure to know what protocol your transport layer is using. So I put in parentheses, defaults to KCP transport, which runs on UDP. So other transports might be using TCP and things like that. If you're using a transport that uses WebSockets, this particular setup will not work for you. But if it's TCP or UDP, this will work. And then again, defaults to KCP transport setting, which is 7777. Now this one will come in at an additional cost, but if you want additional highlights and more granular monitoring metrics on your EC2 server, AWS offers that. So you can enable that if you want. I have it set to false. And then this is the EC2 image that we will be using. As you see, it's a star here. So it's going to find the most recent Amazon Linux 2 AMI. And that AMI is owned by this AWS account ID. You can change this to whatever you want if you want to launch it something other than Amazon Linux 2, but in my personal opinion, that's going to be the best one for you. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to fill out this entire thing, and then I'm going to run it.